Energy Biosciences building, the home of the Energy Biosciences Institute. And I've had a chance to walk around, look at the amazing art. 2 talks tonight are going to be fabulous. I happened to be here last night. Amazing talks last night as well. So it's been a really exciting event to host. Before I introduce the speaker tonight, I'd like to say thank you, huge thank you to organizers of this event. 3 individuals I'd like to name specifically from Science at Cal. That's Rachel Windheld, Monica Albee, and Katie Birchie, who've done a fabulous job pulling this whole event together with a lot of additional help from 2 members from the Energy Biosciences Institute, Shelley Rosnick and Ron Kolb in communications. So, again, welcome. For those of you who don't know, the Energy Biosciences Institute was formed about 7 years ago. And our goal here is to do research into renewable transportation fuels. So we're trying to find new sources of plant biomass that we can grow sustainably and use the best practices in the parts of the world where these plants or biomass sources should be grown. Learn how to take those, break them down into the components, and turn them into transportation fuels. But we need to keep in mind the big picture of all of this, and that's a very significant component of the environmental, the societal impacts, and the economics involved in all of this. So we not only look at the sciences, chemical engineering, and biology, we look at the whole spectrum. So for those of you who want to learn more about the Energy Biosciences approach to discovering or helping to discover transportation fuels, I invite you to come back to the EBI some other time in the future. We do tours just for the building itself, and get a look at the research facilities that we have and learn more about our programs. Okay, so tonight, to introduce the first speaker, this is Michelle Fu. Michelle is a herpetologist and a researcher at the UC Berkeley Museum of Vertebrate Zoology. She's worked in natural history museums for more than a decade and has a special interest in biodiversity and conservation. Tonight, her talk is going to pay tribute to Dr. Robert Stebbins, who passed away actually last September at the age of 98. So Dr. Stebbins did research here at Berkeley on reptiles and amphibians for more than 30 years, and he also taught courses related to those subjects. He was hired as the first curator of the herpetology, or curator of herpetology in 1945. He was celebrated throughout the world for his artistry and his passionate advocacy for ecological preservation. And his books, published as part of the Peterson Guide series, have been essential for naturalist students and weekend hikers all over. So tonight, Michelle's going to tell us about him and his work. And her talk is entitled "A Tribute to the Art and Life of Robert Stebbins." And we'll have time for questions at the end.
Thank you so much for having me. So I just wanted to say that Bob Stebbins was one of these almost fixtures in the Museum of Vertebrate Zoology for so long that it's really hard to even imagine him not showing up unexpectedly on a weekend with interesting stories, or perhaps bags of dead salamanders, as when I first encountered him as a graduate student in the 90s. But, so I wanted to spend a little time, sorry, I'm used to the so I want to spend a little time today just talking about his early history, and maybe fill in some things that people weren't entirely aware of about Robert Stebbins, and also talk about some of the research, the art, and the conservation that meant a lot to him. And I should say that a lot of this I'm drawing on from a variety of sources, but mostly from his own work, because he was a prolific writer, and I'll talk more specifically about resources and things that you can go ahead and read more about Bob Stebbins. So, in the first chapter of his last book, which is called Connecting with Nature, and I'll talk a little bit more about connecting with nature, because it was very outside of Chico. He was the eldest of, I think, 7 children. He has warm memories for those times and continued to go back to his family ranch in Chico, as well as continued his exploration throughout the Bay Area, where he eventually moved to, even after living for a while in Southern California. So one of his first chapters in Connecting with Nature, he talks about his first memory of encountering a reptile. It was capturing this turtle, this western pond turtle, which I have representative here, which he brought to show his mother. And his quote, I don't know if you can read this, it's a little dark, but he says, "I was enthralled by its bright eyes, the feel of its claws, and its whole body as it struggled to free itself from my grasp." One account has him bringing it back home so he can keep it in his bedroom, with his mother releasing it later on in the stream. Another account has his mother actually allowing him to keep it at home. But by all accounts, he kept many reptiles and amphibians and birds. He was originally thought he was going to be an ornithologist at his childhood home. And from there, the early parts of his observational skills were honed. So, not many people actually know that before he even came to become a famous herpetologist, he thought he was going to be an ornithologist. And in fact, his father was an avid birder, and together the two of them wrote several books on the birds of various national parks in California, including Yosemite, the Lassen Volcanic National Park. And Cyril Stebbins, his father, would write the species accounts and the descriptions of those birds. And Bob, as a youngster, would do the illustrations. So these are actually illustrations from the birds of Yosemite. Eventually, he went on, though, to become the famous herpetologist that we all know. He wrote his dissertation on fringe-toed lizards, which reside in the deserts of California, and specifically on this anatomical structure called the parietal eye. How many people have heard of the third eye? Third eye, this is what they're oftentimes referring to. It's actually, I have another image, but you can almost see this slightly darkened area on the top of this particular Uma lizard, which is actually as it was mentioned before, he joined UC Berkeley eventually in 1945, and he became the first herpetology curator. And he stayed there his entire academic career until his retirement in 1978. In those days, the Museum of Vertebrate Zoology looked a lot different than it does today. First of all, they banned the ties at the museum. And this is one of the first MVZ faculty and staff photographs taken, after the war. And we had many vets in the MVZ at the time. And Stebbins himself also did serve and looked into a variety of military-based careers before he settled on herpetology. So there he is. He's actually quite a handsome, striking young man. So these are just a few of the general topics that he, or subject areas that he taught while he was here at Berkeley. He was actually quite well known for one class in particular, the natural history of the vertebrates, which we call ID 104. How many people have heard of that? I think several students in the back certainly have. And it's become one of the quintessential IB MVZ courses. Typically, the MVZ faculty teach this class. It is a field-based course. It teaches several of the observational techniques that our founding director, Joseph Burnell, and Bob Stebbins really drilled into all of their students. And also taught other courses in the then zoology department, but he was also really active in the UC's science committees, which were formed specifically to help set science curricula throughout, well, certainly locally, but also eventually throughout the state. He also did field work. This is him again in his early years. I think this was taken actually out in, I want to say California, but this might have been actually out in farther to the west in the Sonoran Desert. But he mostly was in western U.S. and for these early field works. And I'll talk a little bit more about his field work because this was a really important time for us. He left such a legacy of actual documentation, not just from the specimens that he collected and the research that he published on, but also all the unpublished work. He also was really committed to science education and outreach. He collaborated with the California Academy of Sciences. Back in the 50s, there was a television show hosted by the California Academy of Sciences called Science in Action, and he starred in several of them. And you can see here the topics ranged from mostly herpetology, but also from apparently survival skills as a native Californian. I'm not really sure the full story behind this, but that is a picture of Stebbins with his two children, John and Melinda. And you know, it's treasures like this actually that we're trying to right now work with the California Academy of Sciences to make sure that these tapes, which are on analog actual tapes, eventually become digitized and preserved, because currently they're deteriorating over time. These are just a couple of stills. He also had a role in UC Berkeley's expedition to the Galapagos Island, which I didn't realize that the campus had a multidisciplinary expedition there until I started looking into this. And this was photographed by one of our now retired researchers at campus. Stebbins is relaxing under in the shade of the watches. So by his accounts, by Stebbins' accounts, he felt that he had two major contributions to herpetology. One being the role of the parietal in lizards. So this is one of our California species. It's the western fence lizard. And so it's probably a kind of familiar sight, especially if you're hiking around Tilden or even up in Mount Tamalpais. If you were to capture one of these, which isn't necessarily an impossible task, you can take a closer look at the top of its head, and if you notice, there's this large scale with a slightly pale center to it. That's the third eye, the parietal eye, and actually that pale scale is actually just an opening that allows light to penetrate to nerve bundles underneath. A variety of reptiles have this, a variety of lizards have this, and you see the parietal eye in a number of different kinds of configurations. So this was something that really interested him, especially from his graduate student. So with UC Berkeley's Richard Eakin, who was a developmental biologist in the Department of Zoology, they started a long collaboration and series of experiments to show the functional role of this organ to lizards' metabolism, how it regulates behavior that's important to thermal regulation. As you know, that most lizards need to actually modulate their internal body temperatures by either moving into the sun, moving out into the shade. So the third eye actually is instrumental in those kind of important behavioral actions. It's also important in reproduction reproduction and has, lots of implications about overall metabolism for individuals. So, like I said, through a series of experiments that was conducted here, and that I will also say with some certainty would never be approved nowadays, they were able to show quite definitively its importance to reptiles. The second one, and one that I'm actually more familiar with, and I should just back up just a little bit with the parietal lobe. By the time I became a graduate student, and nowadays when it's taught in herpetology, the role of the parietal eye is just taken for granted. I mean, it's one of these, established sort of areas of research. And likewise, the ring speciation in the Ensatina is held nowadays as a classic example taught in evolutionary and basic biology courses. So this photograph is trying to capture the variety of, in this case, coloration patterns of our native salamander called Ensatina. There's only one species, but there's many, many different subspecies. And so you can see the subspecies that are depicted underneath the photographs. And they vary from these large blotchy, kind of, and slightly blotchy forms to completely solid and pale forms. Some of them have interspersed blotches to only on parts of the body, and some of them actually have a combination of them when the subspecies interbreed and form hybrids. But the distribution essentially rings the Central Valley. The Central Valley of California forms basically an impenetrable barrier for their dispersal, being nowadays much too over-cultivated because of the agriculture, but even before those occurrences, being much too dry and with much more seasonal fluctuations than the foothills around California and our intercoast range, which is where the fog belt really helps modulate those temperature fluctuations that the Central Valley naturally experiences. So among those, though, you can see that you have very separate areas for these different kinds of subspecies, which had been noted for years by herpetologists, but it was Stebbins who kind of fit all the puzzle pieces together and proposed that the species probably originated from the north, from Northern California and Oregon, and in fact, one of the subspecies there extends up into Oregon, and then spread south on both sides of the Central Valley without any contact coming across the Central Valley because of those conditions I was describing for salamanders. Death to a salamander is getting dried out. These salamanders, I should mention, are lungless. They're completely lungless. Their entire mode of respiration is through their skin, so they have to keep it moist at all times. So as these species started migrating south and differentiating into these different color patterns, they eventually met up again in the Tehachapi's and the coastal ranges down into Southern California. And when they did that, you started getting hybrids. And you started getting hybrids with lower reproductive fitness. And eventually, Stebbins went on to argue that these subspecies, if enough time had elapsed, would no longer be able to hybridize with each other. So this was something that many herpetologists actually, this was not something that was treated as a given at the time. Many herpetologists actually tried to publish papers that were later refuted about to separate these out into separate species. And interestingly enough, later on in the 90s, this is after he had retired, the technology had progressed to a means that we could start looking at the molecules that help regulate so this actually helps support his ring speciation hypothesis. And this has been, the study of NTT is still ongoing. We've at least graduated 4 PhD students who used this as a central part of their dissertation. Our former director, Craig Moritz, also came here and published many papers on the molecular study of these evolutionary processes. So it's been a very central part of the NGZ, thanks to Stebbins. He also did some basic species descriptions. I'll just go through these kind of quickly. We have a species from Jimenez Mountains. He also describes the Panamint alligator lizard and the southern torrent salamander, as well as this particular subspecies, which is found in the Bay Area. This one's sort of also interesting because one of the, he was also puzzled why this one, if you remember, the other ones have splotches or patterns or bars. This one doesn't, but it is bright orange. And in fact, it turns out through studies by subsequent herpetologists that they're likely a mimic for our California newts and rough-skinned newts, which are highly toxic. And being a mimic like this actually helps protect them because the snakes that prey upon the Tarica, the newts, don't want to have to froth at the mouth and go into convulsions every time they eat a salamander. So this will probably prevent them from striking the spine. And this has been shown to be the case experimentally as well. So throughout his time at NBZ and his fieldwork, he was really well known for his sketches. And I'm just going to show you a series of some of his sketches. But being at the NBZ, also working with the archives, this has been a real pleasure to help catalog and make sure that these are digitized and preserved for a long time. If you actually go out in the lobby, one of the displays out there features a lot of his artwork. So this section is going to talk a little bit about that. So as you can see here, this is Tarica turosa. He wrote the species name at the top. This is a typical Grinnell-style field nut structure. And he tells us where this particular observation was made, the date, and made the detailed sketch. And here, you know, David Wake, the NBZ director, who's now retired, and who was director at the time when Stebbins was still there, told me that he often would just sketch first drafts. You know, these were all just first drafts. These were not, you know, necessarily worked over. These were his working sketches. So just learning that is quite astounding. So here he is again, now showing a little bit more behavior, how the female newt is actually forming her egg masses. This is all, if you notice, this is all just within the Bay Area, just to drive away. And this is where Stebbins distinguishes himself from just being a sketch artist. He's also making detailed notations and measurements that people have used to help create those field guides and use these as, you know, like I said, primary raw data for these for studies of things like the egg masses and the number of eggs within these clusters. And then he drills down even further and starts looking at the individual eggs, which has been really useful in studies of developmental biology as well. And as he retired, he retired in '78. I was also found out from from a number of people who were around the NBZ at the time in 1978, that he started taking some art classes. And so really this is where, this period of his life, he was really spending most of it in his Kensington studio. And he put his art and his science to really amazing use. These are plates of the original art that shows up in his field guides. But you can see some of the details here that really are amazing. If you can notice that this is our Arborio Salamander, you can see that there's all these costal grooves that are actually things that people will count to help identify them. You can also see some of the lines and grooves along the head of this large male. You can also see some of a line and a groove from the eye of the salamander to the tip of his nose. This is characteristic also of this group of salamanders. And so that's our arboreal salamander that occurs throughout California. This is a sympatric species known as the Black Salamander. He shows two different forms, the spotted one and the black one. And then he also shows us what the juveniles of either species look like. Because obviously with the juvenile forms, they look different than their adult forms, and that's going to be useful for these as a practical field guide to help distinguish, figure out what you have in hand. This is the Panamint alligator lizard that he described, as well as another alligator lizard species that occurs in the Bay Area. And again, counting the number of rows, a herpetologist could use this illustration as a means to identify the specific species that they might have in hand. So if anybody's taken a natural history course or any interest in natural history, especially of reptiles and amphibians, you will end up, I promise you, holding a Stebbins field guide, or a field guide that's been used or edited by Stebbins. He did a number of them, and his first was in 1951 with all the original art done by himself. And he continued to edit these, sometimes with a co-author, all the way up to 2012. So this was his last one right here with his former student, Sam McGinnis. He wrote or contributed to over 70 books and textbooks, including coloring books for children. Like I said, education was still a central part of his emphasis. And nowadays, most herpetologists just refer to these simply as Stebbins. Did you bring your Stebbins? That's what we always ask. The third part that I wanted to talk a little bit about was his conservation concerns. This is just a quick list of some of the species he worked on to help make sure that it had the legal protections that these species needed. He also was very involved in things that had to do with local issues. So from this list, you can see that there's a lot of local issues that had to do with development and impacts to our environment, from gold mines to off-road vehicles. He also helped create and establish ecological study areas around the UC Berkeley campus, including Strawberry Canyon, all of which are still in place. I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about one of these in particular. It was interesting that last week during the lunch seminar series, we had a former NVZ alum come back and tell us about her work working with the Kohala and Carnegie State Vehicular Recreation Area and the ongoing issues there. So I'll spend a little time talking about this because Stebbins actually spent a fair bit of effort and time trying to ensure its protection. So this is the Kohala Watershed and Tesla Park. It's located just outside of the coastal range here. You can see where we are. This is just outside of Livermore, and I'm sorry, but I cut off Livermore for some reason. Well, let's just say that speaker right there is Livermore. So our project site would be that white block. And 580 runs, and 580 then intersects and turns into 5, and this is Highway 5 running all the way down to Southern California. So the Carnegie State Vehicular Area is in this same area. It's 100% of the part of the Kohala Tesla Park is in Alameda County, but the rest of the off-road vehicle site is actually in San Joaquin, crosses San Joaquin and Alameda counties there. So if you've had to be a graduate student in MVZ or IB, you've probably taken a field trip out to this Kohala Watershed. This used to be our go-to spot to find amphibians and reptiles for all sorts of anatomy classes, biology labs. It has a high animal diversity out there. It also has a high plant life, diversity in plant life. There's 50 listed species of plants and animals that can be found there. There's probably many more that haven't been noted yet, but within the known ranges of these animals, at least 80 more listed species are also known from there. And so it's a large variety, including being a golden eagle nesting site. So and here's a few more of the reptile diversity, and I only highlight these because partly because I'm a herpetologist, partly because Stebbins was one of the first people to note and document these species there, and these are all happen to be either state or federally listed. So this is at the time what happened was that they were proposing to turn the Carnegie area park into off-road, off-highway vehicle recreation area and expand it into further into the Kohala watershed. And through Bob Stebbins, Harry Green, David Wake, the rest of the MVZ faculty and IB professors who were affiliated with MVZ, there was a letter writing campaign to parks, to state and government officials trying to ensure that the parks would be not encroached upon. Just to give you sort of a sense of what was at stake, this is the current Carnegie vehicular region. You can see, this is actually a winter picture, so it actually looks a little greener than it normally is. But you can see quite clearly the tracks and the erosion that happens here. And up in the corner is the creek that runs through the Kohala watershed, which I should also mention has very important archaeological significance as well. It was a Ohlone site, ceremonial site as well. So this is not what Stebbins actually had available to him. This is Google Earth. Unfortunately, it wasn't around in the 80s. But this is what's happening today, right now. And this is still an ongoing issue. So we've had, like I mentioned, MVZ alum come back and exhort the MVZ faculty, letting this next generation know about the work of Bob Stebbins in trying to protect the region and this local biodiversity hotspot. And in fact, this was something that was really important to Bob Stebbins, and he spent many, as I had mentioned before, he had spent many years of field work in the Mojave Desert, and he spent much effort now protecting it. So through the 80s and the 90s, he wrote he had letter writing campaigns. He spoke to a lot of public and citizens science events, and eventually in 1994 he was able to help pass with the help of Senator Alan Cranston, who was a huge supporter of Stebbins as well, the California Desert Protection Act, which still remains one of the most progressive pieces of legislation to protect deserts. And why? This is a quote from Stebbins. This is a quote from the report that actually he wrote. He said that the California desert is second only to the Galapagos Islands in what it can teach us about evolution. So he brought an evolutionary perspective to these environmental concerns, these conservation concerns. A few other
Things of note,
Stebbins touched a lot of people. And if you haven't figured this out yet, herpetologists in particular. So what better way than to honor someone you respect in herpetology than to name species after them. So this is a method that herpetologists have, that biologists have at their hands. So these are just a few that are named in his honor: the Sonoran tiger salamander, a listed species.
Batrachus Stebbins, which is
Found in the Tehachapies. This is also a species that's difficult to find, but important in the Tehachapi range, which is where he spent a lot of time, as you recall from the Ensatina ring species. This is where they end up meeting at the bottom. And very recently, 4 new legless lizard species were also described by UC Berkeley researchers. And you can see that they're named, some of them are named after Annie Alexander and Joseph Brunel, and then a 4th one was named after Bob Stebbins. So he has wonderful company. And it's quite an attractive personable legless lizard too. It has a very small, narrow range, and again, in that special sort of meeting zone of biogeography in the Southern Sierras Tehachapi area. So this is just a quick compilation. When Stebbins decided to move up to Oregon in 2009, he didn't want a big to-do. He was quite explicit about this, but we did manage to convince him to come back to NBC one last time. And he came with a clipboard in hand, and he read excerpts from his from the book that he was working on at the time. And you can see it was just a small gathering. We just basically sat around and talked with him, and well, especially after he finished reading a few chapters from his book. So it was our first goodbye. And then later on, in just last September, as was noted, at the age of 98, he did pass away. And the outpouring of memories was just astounding. So we have compiled some of them, which you can go to the NBC website and read yourself. We also compiled a web archive of a lot of the obituaries and memories and pieces that were written about him and his life and impact from around the globe. So you know, I can only give you kind of a brief overview, but there's a lot of rich ideas and thoughts in here. But finally, you should also hear what he had to say. So the chapter that he read on his last visit was actually chapters from this book, Connecting with Nature, which he had said to a number of folks at NBC that he felt it was one of his most important books because it was about educating the next generation about the importance of nature. And I wanted to end with actually his own words. And so I'm going to see if this works. And in 2005, our scientific illustrator and retired archivist Karen Plitz sat down with Stebbins and they did a oral history together. And so this is just an excerpt from that. Let's see if we try that again. She said it's my fault not.
Let's
Let
try.
me get this now.
Is the sound plugged in? Let's see if this works.
Here's my son.
best job in herpetology in the world, probably. Been able to travel many places on the planet. I've seen humanity in utter despair and in terrible conditions, and people with unconscionable wealth. This is very disturbing to anyone. And so I hope I'll die with a smile on my face. And if there's a hereafter, I say to myself, well, I've tried to live an honorable life, and I hope I'll be dealt with fairly in relation to how I've lived. But on the other hand, if this is it, the lights go out. I didn't look at all the things I missed, everybody missed, up to the time they were born. And that connection goes back to the beginning of life on Earth. It's been, as an individual, you are a product of this long, continuous process. That really impresses me. With all that behind us, I've often thought, gee, I wish I had been alive in the days of Lewis and Clark. So I missed a lot. What's ahead?
And cut out. Well, we'll work on the full oral history, actually. This is part of our archive project. So please go see the exhibit out in the front hall.
It's showing 7 sketches. There's a picture of, I'm not sure if it's a salamander or a newt, but it was rolled up with his head.
Oh, I didn't mention that. Right, that's the Unken reflex. They call it the Unken reflex. And that particular posture is specific to that species. And basically what it's doing is showing you, the predator, trying to eat him, his right underbelly, saying, I'm highly toxic, I do not want to eat him. But yeah, the other species actually has a different kind of twist to its body. But yeah, that's something that's special to salamanders. That's a good question. Yeah, it basically has to be special. They don't want to use a technical term. Yeah.
Do you have an update on the Tesla project parks?
I know that there's an ERI supposed to come out, but because of all the hubbub that saves our Tesla park, people have been generated, they keep delaying it, probably because they don't have proper responses to some of the articles coming up. So I think it's ongoing, and actually Sarah Kupferberg, I forgot to mention her, and Celeste Garamondi, they were here, and so we're going to talk to them a little bit more. But I didn't realize that Stebbins and the rest of the NDP actually had drafted a 7-page letter to support the park's protection. And so, which I thought was amazing. It was really well written, and every point that they make is still relevant today. So I suggested that they simply show that again. Most of the people are still living. They can actually re-sign it, reaffirm it, and I think they would have a lot of, that would still carry a lot of weight.
That's remarkable that they got, 7 NBC professors to agree on anything.
I know. That's what I'm saying.
That's really cool.
Yes. I think that's Bob's work, actually, so, yeah. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Your legless lizard photo there at the end was mainly Southern California. When I got here 20 years ago, I found a legless lizard up on the above Point Knoll on the coast. Do you know if that one's still?
Yeah, that one's still. So Aniella pulchra is the main species, and that has a very wide range over most of California. These 4 new species have very small ranges, and it really kind of shows to the complexity of some of the, the species biology and evolutionary history. And they're all down in, like I mentioned, or you saw the picture, the Southern California area. So
But they're still here.
They're still here though, but they're still
Good.
here. That's still a wide-ranging species. Some of those are actually, these were considered subspecies of the pulchra. So, but they've been shown now to be morphologically distinct, somewhat behaviorally distinct, but certainly molecularly, genetically distinct species. So, yeah, but it's pretty amazing how the biodiversity of California continues to increase even today.
So what were some of his most favorite places for reptile observations? Did he have some favorites, or are they just all over?
Well, actually, I think the Kohala was
Oh.
one of them. I mean, he encouraged people to go out there as well. But you know, it seemed to me, what was amazing about Bob was it's anywhere was a favorite place as well. I mean, I know that the deserts hold a special, you know, place because he spent so much time, you know, with the legislators and working those conservation causes. But when I started graduate school here, he encouraged my cohort to go to Tilden to look for salamanders on campus. Told us stories about, you know, which tree had which Andes salamanders, and if we could go find them again. And so, you know, it doesn't really matter. It's just everywhere.
Well, thank you,
Thanks.
Michelle.